Hi, and good evening. My name is John Shook, and this is the show Humanist Matters here on the New Covenant Group. I teach philosophy, I teach science education for the University of Buffalo. Let me give a shout out to the program online, get a master's specializing in science and the public at the University at Buffalo. On this show, we talk about things that are interesting to religious people, non-religious people, whether they might think of themselves as secular or humanist or atheist, agnostic. It's not about the labels, it's about the issues and topics that people are interested in. And tonight, we're really privileged to have with us one of the most interesting, I think, interesting people, very dynamically active in humanism today, and that's Jennifer Shaw Hancock. Hi, Jennifer. How are you?
Hello. I don't know if people can see, but I'm blushing now.
Well, wait till I read your bio. You might blush a little more, but that's okay. You're coming tonight to us from Florida, right?
Yes, it was a lovely day here today, too. 80 degrees and nice.
You're killing us. You're killing us. Here in D.C., it's been a chilly day, and it promises more. Well, we're warmly receptive to Jennifer. Let me talk a little bit about her to the audience. She's one of the top writers, top speakers going out there in the humanist world today. Her message focuses on things like critical thinking, personal ethics, responsibility, humanism as a full expression of not just abstract ideals, but a practical way to live one's life and to make a difference in your community and in your state and maybe even in your country or the world. Jennifer's been making a difference in Florida. Tell folks what you have got on your resume down there in Florida for humanists.
For humanists, let's see. I used to be the executive director for the Humanist of Florida, and that's kind of
Big job.
I did that for about 7 years. And that's how I kind of came to the humanist movement. I mean, I was aware of it and I was a member, but, I didn't really start thinking that humanism was something you actually needed to promote until I had a job where that was my job. And then I realized actually people need to hear about this. It's really when you introduce people to it, they're so excited that I think by not promoting it, we do a disservice to the people who want to learn about it but don't have any opportunity. So I've just kind of made it my life's calling because I think it turns out I'm pretty good at talking about it.
Well, people think you're terrific talking about it. I know you've been invited to organizations large and small, the American Humanist Association, the Humanist Institute, too many state and regional conferences.
International. I've even talked in Scotland.
In Scotland? Wow.
Yeah.
Very nice. You're also reaching out to audiences through your books. We would be remiss without mentioning a couple of them. I happen to have one handy on my bookshelf. I reference it all the time. It is called The Humanist Approach to Happiness. Practical Wisdom, a book about personal ethics, why they are important, and how applying them to your daily life will help you lead a happier and more productive life. That's a big promise to put on a book title.
It is. It is. And it's kind of, when I first wrote it, people were like, what is a humanist doing writing a self-help book? And I thought, well, because people need help.
We all need help.
I'd rather they get it from a rationalist, than a woo-based practitioner. So, why not? But I actually wrote that book because a neighbor's daughter was complaining that her boyfriend hadn't called her. And it turned out to be not a boyfriend. It was a boy that she had sex with and never dated. And it turned out her mom had never, to me, knowing the difference between dating and relationships and where sex fits in is kind of basic knowledge, really practical knowledge. And I thought, well, someone ought to write a book for kids like this whose parents fail them. So I wrote the book.
Even adults need a little bit of help, guiding help from time to time. You've been at this your whole life. I understand you were raised as a humanist, and that's kind of rare.
Yeah, we didn't call it that. My family goes back to the free thought communities of Chicago, actually, and we're third generation. I'm third generation freethinker on both sides of my family. So we didn't, the term was only coined about 100 years ago. So I grew up in a family that we didn't label it anything. We just weren't religious. We weren't. We didn't even use the word freethinker, really, although that's how I was explicitly raised. That was the value of free thought was the predominant value. All right.
Mm-hmm.
But it turns out that this philosophy has a name, but I didn't learn about the name until I was an adult.
Oh, okay.
All right.
And that's
So, but
probably true of plenty of people, wouldn't it be?
exactly. Everybody who kind of grows up in a free thought family that doesn't know about humanism probably ends up at humanism without knowing they're a humanist, because that turns out to be the underlying values that they weren't around in the UU community to know that this term had been coined, because they weren't going to the churches to find out. So, and they weren't reading the religious journals and stuff. They just weren't involved in any of that. So, yeah, third generation free thinker. The big value that I was raised with was, free thought. I didn't know what my family believed or didn't believe. It just wasn't a topic of conversation. Individuals have the right to believe for themselves, and that goes for family members too. So it just never came up. But the big thing was honesty and compassion and social service.
Those are some pretty good foundations.
It sounds a lot like humanism.
Yeah. Well, sure. And where can our audience find you online? Go ahead and mention one or two websites for folks. They're also going to be at the bottom of your screen during the broadcast, but why don't you tell folks now?
Sure. I'm Jen the Humanist. So if you type in Jen the Humanist in the Googles, I'll be like the first 20 pages. So you can find me there. But I've got jen-hancock.com. I've got Humanist Learning Systems, and Jen the Humanist at Facebook, and Jen the Humanist at Twitter and stuff. So, yeah.
Awesome. And you put, I understand, lectures online. People can buy DVDs and those sorts of things.
Sure. There's a bunch of free videos at YouTube, obviously. But I also, at Humanist Learning Systems, we offer life skills education to people from a humanist perspective, a secular perspective. So if you want to learn about, secular meditation and what is the science behind meditation and what happens in your brain when you meditate, we've got a course for that taught by, Rick Heller of the Humanist Mindful Group at Harvard. You've got my 6-hour course, Living Made Simpler, and other things like that, parenting lessons and meditations. Dr. Shirota from the Ruthless Compassion Institute has a course up there. So there's a variety of content. Some of it's free, some of it's for a fee, but there's a lot of good life skills content that we're putting up there. And there's more coming. I've got, a skeptic fitness expert that's going to be doing a course.
Wow, you don't often hear skeptic and fitness in the same sentence.
I know. And that's, the problem that I think we have is that the self-help movement is so woo-based that the average skeptic wants absolutely nothing to do with it. Right? And what I think we need to recognize as humanists is and secularists and skeptics is that if we don't provide a secular skeptical alternative to the self-help that's out there, to the woo-based self-help, then we shouldn't blame people for taking advantage of what's out there, right? Are you
saying that just trying to ignore it and wish it would go away is not enough?
It's not enough. We need to provide a valid alternative to them. And the reality is that self-help can help a lot of people. Most people don't need professional counseling. They can, get some advice from a book and do really well with it. Now, some people do need more professional help, but Here's the thing, right? If we have humanist self-help up there, we can funnel people and will funnel people because we're ethical who need the professional help into the professional help industry, which has a lot of humanists. I mean, there's, you want a humanist psychiatrist or, you can go to the Humanistic Psychology Association and find one. They're all over the country to get humanist-based psychological care. So there really isn't an excuse. We just need to fill that pipeline and compete with the self-help industry so that people get reality-based information that will actually, help them. And then
it sounds to me like you're talking about sort of preventative and self-maintenance.
Yeah.
The ability to, be resilient and work on your strengths so that when times get tough, you may still need some professional help, but you may not.
You may not. It all depends on how you're coping. I know there's been times in my life that I have needed professional help, and I don't hesitate to get it. And I'm always surprised when people hesitate to get professional help, because in my mind, there's things that you may come across that are so extreme, you don't have the skills, and no one around you has the skills because they haven't experienced it. So you really do have to go to a professional to learn the coping skills you need. It's not about being mentally ill. It's about learning coping skills. And that's kind of what I tried to do with the book, The Humanist Approach to Happiness, and what I tried to do with the life skills course is I look at all these people who are coming out of religion, and they're now tasked with figuring out how to live life fully and ethically and happily, and they don't have a framework to really kind of start from. Not
Right.
that they should end where I tell them to end, but just to give them a starting point to start rebuilding an ethical system and a decision-making system, and how do you cope with your emotions in the absence of the belief that you have. And that's what I kind of view my self-help as. It's towards the people who didn't get this life skill training because they were like kind of, failed by their religious upbringing, and just shielded from life to a certain extent by the religious upbringing and what wasn't taught them. So that's what I try to do with this, is to give people that scaffolding that they need to rebuild a coping strategy, but one that's based without supernaturalism.
I think it's so important, and you agree, that humanism has to be as much about helping people transition to places they want to go as it is about any particular, quote, secular destination point. There are many
Right.
ways to be secular,
Right.
and I view humanism as a way to enhance the life that you should have had if you were religious.
Right. And for me, I guess part of it is having grown up as a free thinker and not a secularist, although I'm a secularist politically, obviously. The goal was never, like even with my son, it's not to teach him what to believe or what not to believe. It's to facilitate the individual's right and ability, more importantly, their ability to think for themselves, because it's not enough to have the right to think for yourself. You also have to learn the skills to be able to do it. And those are teachable. So that's how I was raised. I was raised to learn how to think. I was challenged. My thinking was constantly challenged through really obnoxious, continuous Socratic method by my dad. And all of us kids went through that, but because he never wanted us to just have an idea that wasn't challenged. Right. So it wasn't, and we weren't arguing about religion. We were arguing about politics and whatever. And it's all training to think better.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so that was always the goal.
Does that work for morality too? Let's transition into ethics. Is morality just whatever you think it is? He asks in a very misleading way.
Obviously not.
But that's the accusation that we hear from religion all the time.
Right. I think and I understand why they say that, but I always think it says more about them.
Ooh, expand on that, please.
Us. Well, it's I had a girlfriend who remember a few years back when they thought they had found Jesus's or James's tomb. They might have found she was really right. She was really upset that Jesus might not have bodily ascended into heaven. Oh. And I said, why I would think you'd be thrilled that there was actually a historical Jesus. Right? To me, that would be pretty exciting because there's no evidence that there was, right? And she goes, no, but if he didn't bodily ascend into heaven, then everything I'm told is a lie. And I don't know what to believe at that point. I said, but aren't his teachings good enough that they should stand whether or not you were lied to about whether he was divine? And she goes, no. And I'm thinking, are you kidding me? And she's a really good
woman. And us atheists get accused that anything goes if there is no God.
But it says more about them that if there is no God, they literally have no structure for morality, right? And that's not everybody, obviously, because there's a ton of people of faith who, I have another girlfriend who says God is irrelevant, totally irrelevant to her morality, completely irrelevant. Right, she believes that it's completely irrelevant, but there certainly is a portion of the population for which the existence of God and what they've been told,
bodily resurrection, it's something some other doctrine, dogma, something about Jesus.
Right. So when I hear someone say you can't have morality without God, what they're telling me is they don't have morality without God, and that makes them a very scary person to me.
To
right?
me as well, because you
know,
don't know what they're going to do next.
Right. If they, would they go on a rampage? I mean, honestly, I worry about people say, well, you just go on a killing rampage. No, really, if that's what you think you would do, you scare me. So I think it says more about them. Obviously, humanism is all about ethics. Like, let's get back to humanism, right? Humanism is all about ethics. It's about how we decide what is right and what is wrong. And when I do my courses for non-humanists, because it's unusual for me to speak to humanist groups. Most of my work is for non-humanist groups to teach them about humanism. And that surprises people because they want to hear about it. I'm like, yeah. All right. So anyways, what I tell them about the critical thinking is that if you can't think well, you can't figure out what's right and what's true and what's false. And if you can't figure out what's true and what's false, your moral reasoning is going to be flawed because you don't know what's true and what's false. And what's true and what's false is absolutely critical to your moral reasoning. And your ability to think well is critical to your moral reasoning, because moral reasoning is about reasoning, right?
We hope. Yes.
We hope. And so, like in my 6-week course, my 6-hour course, I take people through the entire process. I say, okay, here's, what the difference between religious and secular ethics. And most people do both. It's really not a problem. You can do both. There's no rules, but then we get to the point where it's like, well, how do we decide what's true and what's false? Because you cannot make determinations about what is good and what isn't if you cannot determine what's true and what's false. Right. So the next unit is on critical thinking, where we talk about how do we know what's true and what's false.
Well, how do you know what's true and what's false in morality?
Well, it's not so much that we're going to have, and this is, I think, why humanism embraces a secular, situational ethic, is humanists can look at the exact same facts and come to different moral conclusions about it. All right.
And that's okay.
And that's okay. What we're not. Yeah, it's like the free thought in action, right? What we're more concerned about is that is our starting place at least based in reality, right? Because if it's not, whatever our moral reasoning is flawed, period. It's flawed. And if we can't think reasonably about ethics, about the particular individual situation we're dealing with, then our moral reasoning will be, again, flawed. And if you introduce two sets of flaws to your moral reasoning, the possibility that your moral outcome will be good in reality is kind of low, right? I mean, it's kind of like logic. If you have bad premises and bad logic, you still might come to a good conclusion, but the odds are against it.
Yeah,
right?
It would be just luck.
It would just be luck at that point. And that's how a lot of people approach their moral reasoning, though. And that's not what a humanist does. We look at both of those going, we need our premises to be true, and we need our logic to be good for our conclusion to have a reasonable chance of being good.
Okay. Well, I'll bite. When it comes to morality, what's the most important premise to recognize as a fact?
It depends on the situation, right? I mean, are we talking about war? Are we talking about climate change? Are we talking about whether it was okay to kill Osama bin Laden? I mean, what's the situation that we're talking about?
Well, I'll pick war. I'm sure our audience would love to get to specifics.
All right.
So what is a humanist stance on war? Is there one?
No, there isn't, because it's all situational. One of the first humanist conferences I went to, and it was American Humanist Association conference, I think, held in Washington, D.C. years ago. And we had a guy from the Tabula Rasa Institute come in, and he did a session on just war, where we walked through the concept of, is there such a thing as is there a secular concept of just war as opposed to a sacred concept of just war? And we all agreed that there basically was. Most of us agreed that there were situations, almost all of us agreed that there were situations where the use of force could be considered justified for, to stop other suffering or to stop other violence from occurring. Kind of like the social contract we have with our police force, right? The question then becomes, well, how do you know when the use of force is justified? Right? And we broke into 4 groups, and each of us had a different conflict. And within our groups, we could not agree on whether any given conflict met the criteria we'd all agreed was just war, because we couldn't agree on the facts. Like, what we each knew individually about a particular conflict completely influenced whether we thought that was just or not.
Oh, so each of you were working from a somewhat different evidence base.
Exactly. And it's not that our evidence was wrong. It's that we didn't have necessarily the complete picture of what was true. Because, it's like what one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter, right? Well, that's very, very true. So really what it came down to, and the reason we couldn't decide on whether any given conflict was just or not, is whose information coming out of a conflict do you believe? Mm. And that is a question for skepticism and critical thinking, not morality. So before you can even get to the moral question of whether any given conflict is just or not morally, you have to sort through whether the information you're getting about that conflict is true or not.
Does any individual humanist with their busy humanist lives have time to acquire expertise in foreign policy, local geography and culture, economics, right? Isn't that the traditional argument against sort of democratic ethics? No individual is going to figure any of that out. So we're all incompetent.
That's absolutely true. And what I say in my classes is no one does this perfectly. Like there's no one who does this
really
perfectly.
Nobody does this alone, because together, if we pool our efforts, we would have access to much better information together than we would separately. And we might be able to figure out, to a certain extent, which are the reliable information sources. For example, trust the New York Times and the London Times and the Economist and so forth before you trust anecdotal evidence on Facebook.
Right, exactly. And I think this is why I think the humanist approach to debate is not to win the debate. It's to learn from the debate, ideally. We all, I'm guilty of this too. In the moment, you're like, I'm right, But the reality is a lot of debate within the humanist community is actually really, really civil, because it's a knowledge learning process. By asking someone else questions about what they believe, we're challenging our own thoughts. And it's really hard for non-humanists to really understand why humanists are so fond of debate and disagreement, because they don't understand that it's not about conflict. It's about knowledge acquisition. So if you and I were to have a conversation, and we'll go into a debate about something, not because we actually disagree, but because we're challenging ourselves and each other to think more clearly and to consider other points of view and to really try and fill out that picture as much as possible. So for me, I look at the humanist way of approaching political discussion as the superior one, because it's humble from the beginning, even though people who don't know humanists get really annoyed by us. They don't understand what we're doing and why we're doing it, but it's actually incredibly humble to go into a debate knowing you're probably wrong.
But you're going to learn something in the process.
Right.
And it seems to me that what you're talking about is, because ethics relies on a precarious sort of coherence between the ideals that you wish were more realized in the world and all of that on-the-ground facts that you have to take into account, it's really a learning exploration that has to be done together. No single person's going to figure it all out. So all of this communication and discussion, it looks terribly busy and perhaps a little confrontational, but there's no other alternative if the group is going to take responsibility.
Right. And if you want to have a reasonably good chance of having a good decision or problem solving, when I was with the Humanists of Florida, we were doing collaborative work with an LGBT group. And we had gotten together with them and we were sitting down and we had developed a plan of action. And then me and Jerry Lieberman started debating like this one section of it. And Nadine was like, I thought we already agreed on it. What are you guys still talking about? I'm like,
but it's so much fun. I know, like, Jerry.
Don't worry about it. We've already
Jerry's
agreed.
Terrific, and I can totally understand how that would happen with somebody like Jerry. Very well informed, very passionate about humanism.
Right, and I just rolled with it, but Nadine was what in the world? I thought, don't we have an agreement? Why are we discussing the use of the word "the" in the sentence? It's a humanist thing. Just roll with it.
And what other topics do you think are affecting Americans the most right now, where humanism could make a big difference?
Obviously, the environmental policy is a hugely moral conversation. How we spend our money is a hugely moral conversation. How big should the military be versus whether or not we even pay for food stamps, right? These are all every bit of public policy is a moral discussion worthy of humanist the humanist approach. And I'm biased. Obviously, I'm a humanist, so I think if humanists got together in mass, I kind of envision like this great big think tank where we all get together and we say, okay, what is the optimal way to maximize healthcare as a commodity versus healthcare as a human right? How do we develop a system that does both of those well? And you invite all the humanists and some of you don't, to go and have this discussion. And eventually, if they can agree on something, then we have a solution that's probably going to work.
Wow, it sounds like we need to have humanist town hall meetings.
Right, but you can do it virtually. But the thing is, we don't agree on anything, right? So if we agree, there's a really good reason we've all agreed.
That would be a big deal.
That's a big deal. And that's what I tell people when the humanist organization has come out with a policy statement, on the odd times that it comes out with a policy statement. The process that got us there wasn't run of the mill, right? So if we've all agreed that abortion needs to be legal, there's a reason for it. It's not an arbitrary kind of thing. There's really good reasoning that goes behind it. The same thing with the death penalty needing to be abolished. And you look at all the issues that the American Humanist Association has taken policy statements on, and there are things that the society in general doesn't agree on. But the fact that humanists actually do agree is nothing short of extraordinary, because we don't agree on anything. So, if the humanists agree, I tell people you should pay attention. That's, if you want to ignore the debates in the meantime, go ahead, ignore the debates. But once the humanists have come out with an edict, we're probably right.
Oh, well, sometimes we just have to let history...
You noticed I said probably.
We have to let history judge. These are all experiments. But would you say, in your estimation, sort of listening to where you've been going so far on specific topics, that humanism has been more or less liberal, progressive leaning for generations? Would that be your sense of things?
It's always been liberal and progressive. It's always been liberal and progressive. And a big part of that, like if you look back through history and you look at things that we would now, philosophies and approaches that we now call humanist, they obviously weren't called humanists at the time, but you look at the humanistic writers of the Golden Age of Islam. You look at the humanistic writers in ancient China and India and stuff like that. They were all talking about the same thing. The prescription for how you live your life and make decisions has not changed. Right? It really hasn't. Right? And it doesn't yield a perfect result, because there is no such thing, but it yields a pretty darn good result. And like I tell my classes, if you can improve your outcomes over chance to maybe 60% to 70% accuracy, you have a huge advantage over everybody else in life.
That would be a huge advantage.
Right? You don't need to be perfect to do better. You just need to do better to do better, right? And so that's what I kind of look at it. I think, all these issues, we disagree on them, but as long as you're humble and you accept that you're probably wrong and be willing to learn and be less wrong, you're still going to be wrong, but you're going to be less wrong.
And that's very important.
Right. That these incremental improvements are worth the effort. They really are worth the effort to pursue because of the advantage that they confer upon you. And I think this is... I think this might be one of the reasons why humanists traditionally have been very bad about teaching other people how we do what we do. And it's because it looks messy. It looks messy and it's hard to do. And we recognize.
Why hasn't there just simply been a pope of humanism?
I'll nominate you, John.
No, I decline. If nominated, I will not run.
This is I think the problem, right? We all would not run.
Oh, right. Shoot.
That's the problem. I mean, you look at do you know who Silo is in South America?
Silo
No. In South America. Okay, so he's a humanist speaker, writer in South America.
Oh, okay.
But do you know what his nickname is?
Tell us.
The Messiah of the Andes.
My goodness.
He's an humanist. He's an atheist humanist. He's a humanist. He's a humanist. All right. He founded a humanist group, and it went culty on him, and he had to go in hiding for a while.
Oh.
All right. This is not something a humanist wants, right? Because
that sounds dangerous.
It's so how do you say anathema? I don't know how you pronounce that word.
Antithetical.
Antithetical. Yeah, okay. To everything a humanist stands for, that humanists would just freak out about it. It's like, what? No. You're supposed to question me. Like, you're supposed to question what I say.
I tell people, riffing on an old line, I am a member of no organized secular ideology. I'm a humanist.
Right, exactly. Exactly. So, one of the reasons I'm creating Humanist Learning Systems to have as many different humanist educators as I can is to try and hopefully get around the tendency of humanism to create cults. And I know that sounds really weird to anybody who's a humanist, but we have to understand how
happened much in the United States.
Well, I mean, look at what Jesus was kind of trying to teach.
Oh, you mean
historically,
people with ethical messages tend to get followers who want to keep it going, but they end up resorting to authoritarianism and mystery and nonsense.
Exactly. And humanism is so powerful that like an entire self-help industry is built on humanism light. Right? Mm-hmm. It's humanism without the skepticism is what's mostly taught in the self-help industry. If it's that powerful and creates that much adherence, imagine what full-blown humanism is like when people experience it, right? And we have to recognize that, like, who's in the humanist movement today is largely humble intellectuals, and we don't seem humble, right, to the layperson, but the reality is, the reality is, even Richard Dawkins, who's famous as being kind of bombastic, is actually a really humble person.
Oh, sure.
Right? So we don't come off that way, but the reality is we're totally willing to admit we were wrong, and we actually want to be proven wrong, and we expect when we say, oh, this might be a good way to do it, for people to say, no, I think a different way. And it's like, for me, the most shocking part about publishing my self-help book was how little people disagreed with me. Right? I wrote it in a very opinionated way. I decided not to hide my humanism, to make it front and center, and expect people. The whole point of the book is to be discussed and debated. Like, it's for use in youth groups, where I totally expect them to read a chapter and discuss it with a youth leader about what they agree with and what they don't agree with. To me, that's success. All right? Mm-hmm. And I've only had maybe 2 major complaints about what's in the book. And I'm like, really? Because there's got to be more in there that you don't agree with.
You're just being polite.
Well, no. And I sit there and I think, really there should be more that you disagree with. And I'm kind of shocked that they're not. And people are always so apologetic or angry at me that they disagree with me. And I'm like, if you disagree with me, my opinion is mission accomplished. Right? Because
something has been learned.
Something has been learned. I've caused you to think explicitly about what it is you value. That was my goal. Not to tell you to value what I value, but to make you think about whether or not you agree with what I value.
Yep. Among religious people, it's a good thing to watch them stand on their own 2 feet and take responsibility for what they morally think. Because at least they aren't asking God.
Right. And that's what I kind of... when I talk to atheist groups and secularists, and I say, here's how you need to approach religious people. You actually have to do it as a witness, not as proselytizing. And
that sounds cool. Expand on that, please.
Okay, so proselytizing is, I want you to believe what I believe. Okay. Witnessing is, this is what I believe, and here's why I believe it. You don't have to believe as I do. Okay. And the difference is, when you approach someone in a proselytizing way, whatever you're proselytizing for, and whether it's atheism or religion, the person who isn't is defensive immediately. All right, and so they're not thinking about whether or not what you're saying makes sense. They're thinking about...
They might not even be listening.
They might not even be listening. But if someone comes up to me and says, well, how do you figure out morality without God? I say, well, for me, this is how I do it. All right, now this person is comparing and contrasting their way with my way without me even telling them to do that. They're doing it on their own because I'm not proselytizing, I'm witnessing. I'm telling them this is what works for me. Me, personally, me. All right? And because I'm doing that, it gives them the space to compare and contrast and do that critical thinking for themselves. And that's critical because the goal is not to turn them all into atheists. The goal is to encourage them incrementally to think more for themselves. Baby steps, right? So.
And if people can stand up for their values for themselves because they have judged them, that carries them a long way away from religion. And in fact, if you can have a respectful conversation with a person from any religion, you may find you agree on the values, disagree on the metaphysics. But if you can agree on many ethical principles, for example, now you've really got something pretty powerful there, and some of the mutual suspicion might be dropped.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And this is not to say that there's not space for the angry atheist movement. The angry atheist movement is an important movement in the social dialogue that's happening in the country right now. It absolutely is. All right. It's just I don't have the personality to be an angry. I'm not an angry atheist.
Well,
I just don't have it in me.
You need something to talk about with people after you've expressed your anger.
Well, I don't. I just don't have the anger.
World has to keep spinning. So
I just don't have the anger. I don't work up anger very well. So even if I wanted to be,
I didn't leave a religion. I don't have resentment. Yeah. I was never fooled. I wasn't torn away from anything.
Right. It's a non-issue for me. So it's like I can't imagine a more boring conversation. And so that's why I don't have those conversations. And I realize there's a whole bunch of people who need to have that conversation.
Sure.
I'm just not the person to have the conversation with because I just cannot. I'm just like bored by it.
Well, let's talk about more conversations that you're trying to start. We on this show like to give our audience a little bit of advance notice, a little bit of behind the curtain. Do you have another project you'd like to develop? Maybe there's another book coming.
Okay, so right now I'm working on a Humanist Bible study guide. I just finished up Deuteronomy.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm kind of glad to be done with Moses, to be perfectly honest. 5 books of Moses is enough books of Moses.
I hope NCG's Dr. Michael Jones is listening to this. No, Jen would be a great person to have on the Sunday morning Bible study hour.
I have to say my favorite chapter so far is the guilt song in Deuteronomy. I think it's like Deuteronomy 28 or something like that, the guilt song. I thought that was pretty awesome. But yeah, so I'm working my way through the Bible, and the goal of that is, and you can follow that online at humanistbible.blogspot.com or something, Humanist Bible Study, you'll find it. But my idea was I want to read the Bible as a humanist. I hate it when people take quotes out of context. I hate it when Christians do it. I hate it when atheists do it. And then I look up the quote and I look at the context of the quote and it's completely different. And so what I wanted to do was read the Bible for myself as a humanist in the humanist tradition of reading the Bible for yourself. And I wanted to see what I got out of the book as from morality point of view. Not to judge the book as a stupid book or a non-stupid book or history or whatever. To me, it's a book, like any other book.
Is there good morality in the Bible?
Absolutely. There's one of Deuteronomy. The moral lesson is don't start forest fires.
Wow, Yogi Bear would approve.
Yogi Bear would approve. There's other ones. One of Deuteronomy is don't be stingy to the poor ever. You know. Back in Genesis, one of the story that's usually used to say masturbation is bad, the moral of that story is actually some women don't like being sold into sexual slavery.
Imagine that. No women appreciate that. But what you're saying is there's some common sense morality and very sound ethics in the Bible.
If you read the stories as stories, and the way I look at it is these stories were told for a reason. They're told by humans for humans. You don't have to have any specialized knowledge to read this book. All right? They weren't meant to be pulled apart for particular quotes. right? It's the story that matters. Like, I had a crazy uncle, and he got this woman pregnant, and then she killed his sons, right? And that's what's in the Bible to a large extent.
They're like morality plays.
They're like morality plays, and if you view it from that standpoint, there's some really good lessons there, as long as you're not taking the quotes out of context. Now, when you do get into the rules, those are kind of interesting too, actually. I mean, I enjoyed Deuteronomy a lot more than I thought I would, to be perfectly honest. The first time I read it, I was in kind of a cranky mood. But when I went through and read it again, I'm like, gosh, this is actually really fascinating. What they decided was important, what wasn't. Because, I mean, you're talking about a gigantic cult living in the middle of the desert. They had health issues. I mean, where does the poop go? Where do they, what do they do when someone's got the plague and they don't want everybody else to get it? Who's allowed to be part of the congregation? Who's not allowed to be part of the congregation? This was a cult. This was not just a cult. It was a blood cult. There was a reason why when Pharaoh says, well, can't you do your sacrifices to your God here in the town? They said, no, we can't, because y'all will kill us if we do. Oh. They weren't joking when what they were planning to do was really heinous and weird and bizarre and bloody. Like, really unbelievably, I'm so glad even literalists don't do this anymore. Wow. Because they couldn't do it anymore, because it's insane. And even at the time, they knew it was insane. Even at the time, they knew it was insane. That's why they had to go to the mountain to do it, where no one could see them.
Help our audience. How could such a barbaric people have good morals?
It wasn't so much that, blood sacrifice aside, and it's weird that people who appear to have extreme OCD would want blood sacrifice and blood sprinkled all over them, okay? But they were dealing with very real issues of what to do if, a cow goes missing, right? What to do if someone dies and you don't know who killed them.
Sounds like the rules of the Wild Wild West. You have to have vigilante justice and community policing, and the priests are kind of running the whole thing. It's a theocracy, right?
They were judges. They were the judges, right? So it's, you've got this humongous cult living in the desert, in a campment, eating, I think, as far as I can tell, the manna must have been some sort of insect egg, because it's the size of a coriander seed. So you've got a huge number of people eating bug eggs off the ground for 40 years.
That's a monotonous diet.
It's a monotonous diet, and it's, a lot of people died.
No wonder they thought up crazy stuff to keep them busy in the meantime.
There was fires that raged through the camp. At one point, a bunch of birds die and land in the camp. They all start eating them, but everybody who eats these dead birds ends up with food poisoning and dies. I mean, it's and when you read it in context like that, and you're not picking out quotes, but you read the story, it's a fascinating story, and you understand why some of these rules were put in place in context.
Well, good thing we have situational ethics. We can judge these situation by situation. Right. I take it that by the time we get to the New Testament, you would judge Jesus as much more ethically advanced?
I'm guessing I would. I haven't gotten there yet, but I'm guessing there was, the whole idea that you would go say, we don't need to follow these old blood cults anymore and do these horrendous, weird, bizarre blood sacrifices and sprinkle the blood on ourselves and put blood on our left ear and our left thumb and our left toe. We don't have to do that anymore. We just have to do this. Yes, that would be a huge improvement over what they were doing in the desert.
It sounds like it.
So, and it's interesting because at one point there's a fat fire on the altar, and, and it kind of blows up and kills 2 people, and they decide that, these people weren't pure, and no.
Is that how they handled their industrial accidents?
Yeah, it was their fault. They weren't pure. They should have never come before God.
Oh, dear.
Yeah.
So I guess it's possible for a humanist to learn from religions, right?
I would think you'd have to. For me as a humanist, I don't care where the knowledge comes from, right? It's not that there's these are humans. Humans wrote that book. from my perspective, right? So what did they know? What were they trying to deal with? How did they solve their problems? That's interesting to me. And it's just as interesting as reading the Rig Veda or reading the Star Wars books or reading whatever, because every time, and this is why I think the humanities are a form of humanism, is every time you learn about how someone else deals with adversity. And right, and there's that great essay in the Journals of Humanism that you included about the hero story. When we think about heroes and how they overcome diversity and how they're dealing with that, we compare ourselves to them and think, would I be capable of that? What sort of person do I want to be? How do I judge my morality? How do I judge whether this was moral or not, especially when the lead character is flawed, right? We learn who we are by learning about other people's stories. We learn what we value by learning about other people's stories. And to me, that's how do you know what you value if you don't spend any time explicitly thinking about what it is you value? So for me, this reading is central to developing your own moral code.
Sounds to me that humanity, therefore, would be better off with more stories, more narratives, more access to cumulative human wisdom. You don't really expect atheism to just invent morality starting from a blank sheet of paper, then.
How could it?
Yeah, exactly. How could it?
How could it? It has to have the stories. You know, because it's all about the situation. There's a really great, I've gotten very much into Indian movies. And there's a really powerful movie called Fauna. And the first half of this movie, because they're 3-hour-long movies and you get 2 movies for the price of one. So the first half of this movie is a romantic comedy, musical. All right. The second half of this movie is...
Bollywood is awesome.
The second half of this movie is almost, it's like Cape Fear. It's like watching Cape Fear.
Oh,
all right. And our lead actress has to make a decision about whether or not to kill the man she loves at the end of this movie. And the way that the moral argument is framed and the ending message of this thing, and the reason I like Indian films is because they are the most humanist films being made in the world today, is she says in the voiceover, morality is not about the big questions, what is good and what is bad. Morality is about deciding between the greater of two goods or the lesser of two evils.
Oh, the tragic choices in life.
Because if the good and bad, that's easy. But if your morality is not capable of helping you determine between the greater of two goods or the lesser of two evils, you don't have a functional morality.
Doesn't just praying to God and thinking you get an answer solve your problems?
Well, if you don't care,
so much.
well, I mean, if you don't care whether you've got a good morality or not.
That's the thing.
Right.
You put your finger on it. If you're going to take responsibility, there's going to be no authoritative voice coming down from a cloud to tell you how to settle these things.
Right, because if it's not up to you, and this is, I think, the problem with, you know, the family morality, right? The secret cult at the heart of American power. Have you read Jeff Charlotte's book, The Family?
Frightening, yes.
Oh, it's
Jeff Charlotte
terrifying.
has several books out. Yeah.
Right. Well, what bothers me about that morality is that their opinion is whatever they're doing is God's will. So even if they're causing suffering, that must be God's will, so it must be good. And I can't think of a more horrifying way to approach morality than that. I mean, it's horrifying to me. I'd rather people...
It's the abandonment of morality, it seems to me.
It's actually people who allow a priest to tell them what's right and wrong are better than that. Like, right? It's a better morality than that. Everything I do is good because it must be ordained by God. Period. That's terrifying to me. I'd rather people at least have some sense that some things are bad, right? than nothing is bad.
Well, there's nothing more dangerous on this planet than somebody thinking that the divine creator of the universe approves of everything they do.
Right. It's terrifying. And then they say we don't have a morality. What? Right? We at least have some things we think are considered bad.
Good point. Good point. Well, we've been talking tonight with Jennifer Hancock, who's been giving us some insights into humanism. Tell folks again where they can go to find you online.
Type in Jen the Humanist into the Googles, and
you will find her.
You will find me. I'm like the first 20 pages.
Your website is terrific. Your books are fantastic. Your training is outstanding. And it sounds like you're really plugged into what we need the most for humanism for the 21st century?
Well, I hope it works. We'll see.
We'll see. Oh, the humanism thing again. We got to actually try it.
Yeah, you got to try it. We'll see. You know, I think there's some potential there. There's certainly people who want to learn about humanism. So reaching out and creating that market for them so that they can find this education for themselves and then entry that into other, a more in-depth learning. Different people are going to have different depths of knowledge they want. So, we have to provide that for them. And right now, we don't. We don't have entry points for the layperson. We have entry points. People who are coming out of we have entry points for people coming out of faith that have issues with that, but we don't have entry points for, say, a businessman or a nurse or whatever. And those are the people. Like, if we want more humanism in business, shouldn't we teach them that? If we want more humanism in the nursing field and the medical schools, well, now we have humanism in medicine. That's a big deal in the last 20 years. So that's happening. But that's because someone said, we want more humanism in medicine, and they created a foundation to promote humanism in medicine, right? So we need to do the same thing in self-help. If we want more humanism in self-help, we need to create humanist self-help.
Because there isn't going to be a God that's going to do it for us, is there?
Exactly. It's like not going to happen just because we want it to happen.
We have had a terrific time. Unfortunately, our time has to be just 1 hour, so we're going to say goodnight. But we hope you can come back soon, Jennifer.
All right. Well, anytime you want. You're right. It went quickly.
Well, they let me do this show once a week, so it won't be too long.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, good. It was good speaking to you again, as always.
Awesome to see you, and I'm sure our audience really benefited from it, because this is the show Humanist Matters. I'm your host, John Shook, and we're part of the New Covenant Group, because this is the place where people can come together, religious, non-religious, whatever they happen to call themselves, to talk about the real issues and find out things that we can agree on. And I think we can agree on some values. Even if we're not terribly sure if we exactly know how to apply them, we still have an obligation to try. And I think, Jennifer, you agree with that.
Oh, yeah. I don't even care how you got them, just that you have those values.
Please, live by them. That's
Exactly.
enough, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for joining us tonight, Jennifer, and good night to you. And
Good
good
night
night
to you
to our audience. Thank you very much for joining us here on Humanist Matters.